close your eyes and picture a quiet apartment in New York City in the year 1882. The lamps have been blown out and the room is hushed, lit only by the faint glow of a single candle. A family gathers close, waiting for something new, something almost unthinkable. Then, with the flip of a switch, the darkness is broken. A single electric bulb hums to life, flooding the room with a steady, golden glow. For the first time, night feels different. For the first time, the future feels within reach. They called this era the Gilded Age. Newspapers wrote of fortunes being made, of railroads stretching across the horizon, of cities rising higher and brighter than ever before. But behind that thin layer of gold were shadows, immigrants crowding into tenements, farmers struggling to keep their land, workers marching for fair hours and wages. The 1880s were a time of light and shadow, of hope and hardship, of dreams flickering against the realities of everyday life. Tonight, we'll take a gentle walk through that decade. We'll hear the clang of factory machines and the whistle of a distant train. We'll see the Statue of Liberty through the eyes of those arriving for the very first time. And we'll cross the Brooklyn Bridge as its lamps flicker in the fog. Along the way, we'll remember the inventions that shaped the century to come, and the quiet human moments that history books often overlook. This is Sleepy Town Radio, where we tell quiet stories for quiet hearts. Settle in, let your shoulders soften, and allow the story of 1880s America to carry you back to a world both gilded and raw, where the glow of a new age was just beginning. In the early years of the 1880s, America stood at the edge of a quiet revolution, one that began not in the halls of government or on the frontiers of war, but in the simple act of turning night into day. For centuries, the setting sun had marked a natural boundary. After dusk, families huddled close by the faint glow of candles or the smoky flicker of kerosene lamps. Night was a time of shadows, of lowered voices, of work put aside until morning. But in September of 1882, a new kind of light was born. At Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan, Thomas Edison unveiled his central power station, a plant that sent electricity coursing through wires to homes, businesses, and streets. For the first time, blocks of a great city were illuminated not by flame, but by a steady, humming current. Imagine standing there on those cobbled streets. The air carries the smell of horses and coal smoke, and the sound of carriage wheels echoes down narrow lanes. Suddenly, the darkness is pushed back by lamps that glow with a brilliance unlike anything people had seen before. It was not the uneven flutter of a wick, but a calm, unwavering light that seemed almost magical. Children stared wide-eyed, holding their parents' hands. Shopkeepers stepped outside, their faces bright in the glow, marveling at this new gift of science. That first network was small, just a few square blocks, but its meaning stretched far beyond Manhattan. It signaled the beginning of a new era, a promise that life after sunset would never again be the same. Streets could be safer, factories could run longer hours, and homes could enjoy evenings free from the constant tending of flame. Electricity was not simply a new tool. It was a symbol that the impossible could become ordinary. For many Americans born in the 1840s or 1850s, this transformation felt astonishing. In their childhood, they had read by candlelight or lantern. As adults, they had grown used to the kerosene lamp. its glass chimney smudged with soot. And now, in their middle age, they found themselves stepping into rooms where a single switch could summon instant daylight. To live through such a shift was to feel history bending within the span of one lifetime. Of course, electricity's reach in the 1880s was still limited. Beyond the great cities, most of the nation remained dark at night, its barns and farmhouses lit only by kerosene and moonlight. But the change was coming fast, spreading outward like ripples on a pond. By the close of the decade, arc lights glowed in public squares, and electric streetcars clattered through neighborhoods, pulling entire communities into this shimmering new rhythm. It is easy to forget, in our own age of constant light, just how profound this first glow must have felt. It was more than brightness. It was reassurance, possibility, a vision of progress made visible to the eye. When the lamps of Pearl Street came alive, America stepped into a new age, where invention promised to reshape not only the way people worked and traveled, but the way they dreamed after dark. And so, the 1880s began not only as a gilded era of fortunes and expansion, but as a time when the very rhythm of night and day was rewritten. In the quiet hum of those first bulbs, a nation glimpsed the future and knew that life would never be the same again. The mornings of the 1880s often began not with the sound of bird song, but with the long, shrill cry of the factory whistle. Its echo rolled through crowded neighborhoods, bouncing off brick walls and narrow alleys, calling thousands of men, women, and even children to the day's labor. For America, the new decade was defined by motion, by gears turning, furnaces blazing, and the steady rhythm of machines that seemed never to rest. Inside the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the air shimmered with heat. Vast furnaces glowed like open suns, spilling sparks into the dim interior. Men with sleeves rolled high swung heavy tools, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. Steel, once a scarce and precious material, poured in great rivers from Carnegie's mills, destined to become rails, bridges, and the skeletons of rising cities. Each clang of hammer against metal was another heartbeat in the growing chest of an industrial nation. Farther east, in Cleveland and New York, another empire was taking shape. John D. Rockefeller's oil refineries spread across the landscape like small cities of their own. Rows of storage tanks stood like silent sentinels, holding the black liquid that fueled lamps, lubricated machines, and promised fortunes. The smell of crude oil drifted over the rivers, sharp and lingering. Workers moved methodically, their tasks repetitive but vital, each one a link in the immense chain of production. Factories of every kind multiplied during this time. Textile mills filled with the hum of spindles. Shoe factories, glass works, and furniture plants all churned with activity. The American worker, once tied mainly to the soil, was being drawn into a new life, one defined by long hours under artificial light, the roar of engines, and the cadence of machines. But industry was not only about the powerful few or the endless machines. It was also about the families whose lives were measured by the whistle. At dawn, fathers and sons walked side by side toward factory gates, their lunch pails clanking in rhythm with their steps. Mothers sewed garments or rolled cigars in workshops, fingers moving quickly to keep pace with quotas. And in too many places, children as young as 10 worked among them, their small hands nimble enough to handle threads and tools that adults could not. For these families, industry was survival. Meager wages that kept bread on the table and coal in the stove. The noise of industry was not limited to the inside of factories. In every city, one could hear the grind of carts carrying raw materials, the hiss of steam rising from engines, and the sudden blasts of horns at rail yards. Even the very air seemed alive with movement, thick with smoke and dust, as if the nation itself had become one giant machine, its cogs turning ceaselessly. And yet, there was pride in this labor. Immigrants and native-born alike felt that they were building something larger than themselves. Each beam of steel, each barrel of oil, each length of fabric was part of the larger story of America, transforming from a patchwork of farms into an industrial power. Though wages were low and hours long, many workers believed that their sacrifices would open doors for the next generation. When night fell, the factories did not sleep. In many places, electricity allowed production to continue after dark. Windows glowed faintly against the black sky, while the whistle once again pierced the evening air, this time signaling the end of a shift. Workers trudged home tired, but knowing that tomorrow the rhythm would begin again. The pulse of industry in the 1880s was steady and strong. It carried within it the promise of progress, but also the weight of exhaustion. It was a heartbeat that quickened the pace of a nation, reshaping not only its economy, but the daily lives of millions who woke and slept to the call of the machine. Across the wide expanse of 1880s America, the rhythm of life began to follow a new kind of heartbeat, not from the factory floor this time, but from the steady wheels of the railroad. Trains had been part of American life for decades, but in these years, they became the defining thread that stitched the nation together. Steel rails stretched farther than ever before, linking remote towns with great cities and carrying both goods and people across distances once thought impossible. Imagine a small station on a chilly morning. The platform is crowded with travelers wrapped in heavy coats, their breaths rising like mist in the cold air. Somewhere down the track, the faint rumble begins, an iron horse pushing through the fog. Children press close to their mothers as the whistle cuts the air, long and mournful, sending shivers through the waiting crowd. For many, this was the sound of opportunity, a chance to leave behind the familiar and chase something new, whether in Chicago, St. Louis, or far beyond the Mississippi. Railroads did more than move people. They carried wheat from the Great Plains, coal from Pennsylvania, steel from Pittsburgh, and lumber from the Northwest, weaving every region into the same economy. A farmer in Kansas could see his grain loaded into a rail car and know it might feed families in New York within days. Goods that once took weeks or months to reach their markets now traveled swiftly across the land, shrinking America and making it feel, for the first time, like one connected body. But with this progress came a challenge both practical and deeply human: time itself. Before the 1880s, every town set its own clock according to the sun. Noon was when the sun stood highest, whether you lived in Boston, Denver, or a tiny rural hamlet. It made sense for daily life, but it created chaos for the railroads. Schedules could not be trusted. A train might leave one station at noon and arrive at the next at noon as well. though the towns might be minutes apart in solar time. In 1883, the railroads forced a solution that changed the very way Americans lived. On November 18th of that year, they adopted a new system of standardized time, dividing the nation into 4 zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. At noon that day, telegraph operators across the country received the signal to reset their clocks. In an instant, thousands of towns gave up their local time for the certainty of a shared rhythm. It was called the Day of Two Noons. In many towns, people gathered outside courthouses and city halls to watch the official change. Some marveled at the idea, how strange and modern it felt to obey a distant signal carried over wires. Others resisted, clinging to their old local noon as a symbol of independence. Yet, over time, the new system became second nature. The railroad's need for order had quietly reshaped the way every American thought about the hours of the day. Picture again that crowded station, but now notice how many eyes turn toward pocket watches. The station clock matches the one in the next town and the one 100 miles away. When the conductor calls out 3:15, everyone knows exactly what that means. Whether they are in Ohio or Nebraska, time itself has been bound together as tightly as the rails beneath the train. The railroad was not just a machine of iron and steam. It was a teacher of discipline, of coordination, of a world where distance and time could be conquered. The whistle at dawn or dusk became part of the nation's soundscape, a reminder that life was moving faster, more precise, more interconnected than ever before. And in that steady rhythm of wheels turning, clocks ticking, and schedules kept, the United States entered a new chapter. The railroad did not simply connect cities, it synchronized lives, setting the tempo of modern America in motion. High above the streets of Chicago in the mid-1880s, a new shape began to pierce the sky. For generations, American cities had spread outward, rows of brick houses, warehouses, and modest storefronts hugging the ground. But in 1885, something extraordinary happened. A building reached higher than any before it. The Home Insurance Building, 10 stories of steel and stone, opened its doors and changed the imagination of a nation. It may seem small to us today, but to those who first gazed upward at its towering frame, it was nothing short of breathtaking. Never before had such a structure loomed over the sidewalks, its skeleton made not from heavy masonry walls alone, but from a lattice of steel beams that bore the weight and allowed the walls to rise thinner, taller, lighter. It was not only an engineering feat, it was a signal that the American city was ready to lift itself toward the clouds. Picture the workers who raised it. They balanced on narrow girders high above the ground, the wind tugging at their coats as they hammered steel into place. Below them, horses pulled carts loaded with bricks and iron. Passers-by craned their necks to marvel at the sight, shading their eyes against the sun. To many, it seemed impossible that such a delicate frame could hold so much weight, and yet there it stood, proof that the age of industry was not only about the roar of machines, but about daring to reshape the skyline itself. Chicago was the perfect birthplace for this new form. Just 14 years earlier, the Great Fire of 1871 had swept through the city, leaving devastation in its wake. Out of the ashes came a spirit of renewal, a determination to build stronger, higher, more modern. By the mid-1880s, architects and engineers were experimenting with bold ideas, testing steel frames, elevators, and fireproof materials. The home insurance building was their triumph, a declaration that from ruin could come innovation. And yet, the rise of the skyscraper was not just about materials and engineering. It was about what people felt when they looked up. For ordinary Americans, these new towers became symbols of ambition and progress. Standing at the base of such a building, one could feel both small and inspired, reminded of how quickly the world was changing. Inside, the building told its own story. Elevators carried passengers upward, sparing them the long climb of stairs and introducing a new kind of vertical life. Offices filled with clerks, managers, and businessmen who looked down on the bustling streets from heights once reserved only for church steeples. To sit at a desk 10 stories above the ground was to feel part of something futuristic, something only just beginning. Other cities soon followed. New York, St. Louis, and later Pittsburgh began their own climbs into the sky. One by one, the skylines of America began to shift, trading low, uniform rooftops for jagged peaks of steel and glass. Each building became a monument, not only to commerce, but to the restless drive of the age, to reach higher, to see farther, to prove what was possible. Of course, not everyone welcomed this change. Some mourned the loss of open skies and sunlight, worried that the city would become crowded with shadows cast by these towering walls. Others feared the pace of life would grow even faster, as offices filled with endless paperwork and the streets below darkened under canyons of stone. Yet the skyscraper could not be stopped. It was the embodiment of the Gilded Age itself, bold, glittering, and hungry for the future. As the sun set over Chicago, its golden light reflected off the new steel and glass, shimmering in the evening haze. To stand there, gazing upward in 1885, was to glimpse the dawn of the modern city. America was no longer a nation content to build outward. It was now a country daring to climb. The year was 1886, and in the gray waters of New York Harbor, ships arrived almost daily, carrying thousands of hopeful souls. Families crowded the decks, their faces weathered from weeks at sea, eyes fixed on the horizon. And there, rising slowly from the mist, stood a figure that would forever shape the American imagination. The Statue of Liberty, newly unveiled, lifted her torch high as if to welcome them home. For many, it was the first sight of America, a towering promise of freedom and opportunity. Mothers whispered prayers, fathers clutched their children closer, and young men and women felt a rush of wonder, believing that the land before them would hold the answers to their dreams. In that moment, the hardships of the voyage seemed worth it. Hope gleamed as brightly as the copper statue that shone in the morning light. But once the ships docked and the paperwork was done, the reality of America revealed itself in harsher tones. Immigrants poured into the crowded districts of Manhattan and Brooklyn, often crammed into tenements that seemed barely fit for human life. Rooms meant for one family held 3. Windows looked out onto brick walls just a few feet away. The air was heavy with dampness, and narrow stairwells echoed with the cries of children and the shuffle of tired feet. The dream of wide streets and open homes gave way to crowded alleys and dimly lit corridors. Yet even in those cramped quarters, the spirit of resilience was strong. Neighbors helped neighbors, pooling what little they had. Women washed clothes late into the night to bring in pennies. Men rose before dawn to labor in factories or on construction sites, building the very city that seemed at times to close in on them. Language barriers and prejudice often made life even harder. Newspapers of the day carried headlines warning of foreign hordes. Jobs were scarce, and competition was fierce. Many employers offered the lowest wages to the newest arrivals, knowing that desperation left them little choice. Still, the immigrants endured. They carried within them an iron determination that if not for themselves, then for their children, life here would be better. The harbor itself became a place of constant motion. Ferries crossed the water, bringing newcomers ashore. Longshoremen unloaded crates of goods while immigrants disembarked, clutching small bundles of belongings, the sum of their old lives reduced to a few worn bags. Above it all, the Statue of Liberty watched silently, a beacon that promised much, even if the road to achieving it was long and difficult. And yet, for all the hardship, there was something profoundly moving in those first steps onto American soil. Diaries and letters from the time described tears streaming down faces, the trembling of hands touching the ground, and the simple relief of arrival. For them, this harbor was not just an entry point. It was the threshold of a new existence, where centuries of tradition could mix with new ideas, and where families could begin again. Looking back now, we see how deeply those years of migration shaped the nation. By 1920, more than a third of America's population traced their roots to these arrivals. They became workers, shopkeepers, teachers, and soldiers. They built neighborhoods, churches, and businesses. They carried recipes, songs, and traditions that blended into the great tapestry of American culture. In the hush of memory, we can still imagine that harbor in 1886. The creak of ship ropes, the gulls circling overhead, the swell of voices speaking dozens of languages, and in the distance, the soft glow of a torch raised high above the water, a reminder that America was both a promise and a challenge, a land where hope and hardship would forever walk hand in hand. Down the narrow streets of lower Manhattan, where the air hung heavy with smoke and dampness, whole worlds existed behind the brick facades of the tenement houses. From the outside, the buildings seemed plain. Rows of windows stacked high, laundry strung across narrow courtyards. But stepping inside was to enter a very different America, one that stood in sharp contrast to the promise of freedom that had greeted families at the harbor. A single building might hold a dozen families, each crammed into rooms so small they barely fit a bed and a table. Walls seeped with moisture, and the wood floors creaked under the shuffle of too many feet. In some apartments, the only light came from a narrow air shaft, where voices and smells from other rooms drifted constantly. Privacy was nearly impossible. Life was lived within earshot of one's neighbors, arguments, lullabies, and the scrape of a chair carried easily through the thin walls. Children grew up in these tight spaces, their laughter echoing down stairwells, their games played on splintered wooden steps or in alleys littered with refuse. They learned early how to climb the rickety fire escapes or balance on stoops, making the streets their playground. Disease was a constant threat. With no proper sanitation, illnesses spread quickly through the crowded rooms. Yet even here, resilience flourished. Families decorated walls with small tokens from the old country: a crucifix, a hand-woven cloth, a photograph carried across the sea, to remind them that their identity had not been lost. The smell of tenement life was unforgettable. Coal smoke mixed with the odor of boiling cabbage, kerosene lamps, and damp plaster. At night, the soundscape told its own story: a baby's cry, the drip of water from a leaking ceiling, the clatter of boots on the stairway as a weary father returned home from the factory. For women, the tenement was often both home and workplace. Many took in piecework, sewing garments by hand, rolling cigars, or mending clothes, straining their eyes late into the night to earn a few extra cents. Men rose before dawn to labor in sweatshops or on the docks, while older children were sent to sell newspapers, shine shoes, or even join their parents in factory work. Every penny mattered. Despite the hardships, there were moments of warmth. Neighbors shared food when one family had none. Mothers kept watch over each other's children. On Sundays, families spilled into the streets in their best clothes, walking to church or synagogue, seeking both faith and community. In these moments, the tenements became not just a place of survival, but a place where new bonds of belonging were forged. Still, the dream of America felt fragile within those walls. The Statue of Liberty's promise of opportunity seemed distant when nights were spent listening to rats scurry in the walls or worrying whether the rent collector would come too soon. For many immigrants, the tenements were both the first step into the new world and the hardest test of endurance. And yet, from these crowded rooms, a generation grew. Children raised in tenements would go on to become shopkeepers, teachers, and leaders. They carried the memory of cramped stairwells and dark hallways with them, shaping their determination to find something better. The tenements of the 1880s, harsh as they were, became the crucible of the immigrant story, a place where suffering and hope existed side by side, and where the American dream was tested in the most ordinary, everyday struggles of life. In the 1880s, the nation's story was not only written in factories, railroads, or crowded city blocks, but also in the quiet chambers of Washington. The decade saw more change at the very top than any in recent memory. 5 men: Rutherford B. Hayes, James A. Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, Grover Cleveland, and Benjamin Harrison, each took the oath of office, one after the other, their names etched into a period of both turbulence and transition. The tale begins in 1881 with the tragic fate of President James Garfield. Only a few months into his term, he was shot by a disgruntled seeker of political favor, Charles Guiteau. The nation waited anxiously for weeks as Garfield lingered between life and death, doctors doing all they could with the medicine of the day. When he finally passed that September, grief swept across the country. Citizens gathered on porches and in parlors, speaking in hushed tones, not only of his death, but of the deeper illness it revealed, an era where public offices were too often handed out as rewards for loyalty, not merit. Into that vacuum stepped Chester A. Arthur, a man many had dismissed as a product of the very spoils system Garfield's assassin had exposed. Yet, to the surprise of critics, Arthur rose to the occasion. He supported the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, a law that quietly changed the fabric of American government. It declared that certain positions would no longer be won by political connection, but by examination and merit. It was a small beginning, but for many it felt like a cleansing breath in an era clouded by corruption. Still, politics in the 1880s remained a shifting and uneasy stage. Grover Cleveland entered the White House as the first Democrat elected since the Civil War, his victory celebrated as a sign that old wounds were beginning to heal, even if only on the surface. His reputation as a man of integrity brought hope, though his decisions often sparked controversy. Then came Benjamin Harrison, who took the presidency after a hotly contested election, adding yet another layer of change to an already unsettled decade. Across those years, ordinary Americans felt the weight of political uncertainty. Newspapers carried the latest debates into homes and workplaces, filling the air with arguments about tariffs, civil service, and the role of government in everyday life. On summer evenings, neighbors leaned against fence posts, murmuring about what it all might mean for the price of goods or the fairness of opportunity, for the farmer in Kansas, the laborer in Chicago, or the immigrant in New York. Politics could feel distant, yet its decisions touched every table and every wage. The shifting faces of leadership mirrored the shifting character of the country itself. It was a time when democracy showed both its fragility and its resilience. Presidents could fall to violence, be undone by scandal, or be replaced by the narrow margin of a vote. And yet, the system endured. Through election after election, the voice of the people still held power, however imperfectly. Looking back now, the political story of the 1880s feels like the restless turning of a wheel. It carried the nation from old habits of patronage into the beginnings of reform, from post-war division into the cautious steps of reconciliation. It was not a decade of stability, but one of movement, sometimes painful, sometimes hopeful, and in the quiet reflection of memory, we can still imagine a family gathered around a kitchen table, a newspaper spread wide, the father reading aloud the words of a president's speech. The lamp flickers, the children listen, and outside, the night carries on. In those simple scenes, the pulse of democracy was alive, shaping a nation that was still learning how to govern itself with honesty and with vision. Far from the grand halls of government and the gleaming new bridges rising above America's rivers, another story was quietly unfolding, one written not in triumph, but in sorrow. In 1882, the United States passed a law that would cast a long shadow over countless lives, the Chinese Exclusion Act. For decades, Chinese laborers had crossed the Pacific, lured by tales of Gold Mountain and the promise of steady work. They had swung hammers on the transcontinental railroad, carved tunnels through rock, and tilled the earth in fields that stretched wide beneath the western sun. They had opened laundries in small towns, cooked meals in mining camps, and swept streets in growing cities. Their hands were part of the great engine that carried America forward. And yet, when prosperity grew uncertain and competition for jobs sharpened, resentment rose like an unwelcome tide. Politicians and newspapers stirred fears that Chinese workers were taking too much, earning less, or refusing to blend into the broader fabric of society. Prejudice hardened into policy, and with a stroke of a pen, an entire people were told they no longer had a place. Imagine a group of men huddled in a dim boarding house on a cold evening, the only heat coming from a small coal stove. They share a simple meal of rice and vegetables, their chopsticks clicking softly against bowls. One man holds a letter from home, written in characters no one around them outside this room could read. His eyes are heavy with longing. The law now says no wives or children may follow. Families remain divided by an ocean, years stretching endlessly between reunion. For those already here, life became even harder. Violence sometimes erupted in mining towns or city alleys. Threats drove whole communities from their homes. And yet, despite the harshness, many endured. They saved what little they could, opened shops, and built Chinatowns that became sanctuaries of language, food, and tradition. Lanterns glowed in the night. Festivals filled narrow streets with music. And in these moments of resilience, they carved out a fragile sense of belonging. Still, exclusion left scars deeper than the eye could see. It carried the painful message that some were welcome to build the nation, but not welcome to be part of it. That contradiction lingered in every weary glance, every whispered prayer at the small altars tucked into tenement corners. History often remembers the bold speeches and the marble monuments. But there are other memories, quieter ones. The tired sigh of a man folding his work clothes after a 14-hour shift. The soft sob of a mother denied the chance to join her husband in the new land. The silence of a dinner table where one chair remains empty. These are also the stories of the 1880s. The Gilded Age promised opportunity, but it also revealed the fragility of acceptance. While some doors were flung wide open for immigrants from Europe, others were nailed shut for those who came from Asia. The glow of progress was real, but so too were the shadows it cast. And so, as the decade marched on, the Chinese Exclusion Act stood as both a law and a symbol, a reminder that beneath the shimmering promise of America, there remained boundaries drawn by fear. In those shadows, ordinary people lived, worked, and hoped, holding tightly to the belief that dignity could survive even where welcome was denied. Out on the wide prairies, beneath skies that seemed endless, another story of the 1880s unfolded, one far removed from the bustling cities and glittering inventions. It was the story of lands slipping away, of nations within a nation watching their world fade. For centuries, the native peoples of the Great Plains had lived with the rhythm of the buffalo, the sweep of the seasons, and the memory of ancestors buried in the soil. By the 1880s, those rhythms were breaking. Herds that once darkened the horizon had been hunted nearly to extinction. The thundering sound of hooves was giving way to the creak of wagon wheels and the sharp whistle of locomotives. In 1889, the Oklahoma land run became the most visible symbol of this change. On that April day, thousands of settlers lined up at the borders of what had been promised as Indian territory. At the sound of a gunshot, they surged forward. Wagons, horses, riders, and runners, racing to claim parcels of land that did not belong to them, but to the tribes who had been pushed there decades earlier on trails of sorrow. Dust rose in great clouds. Voices shouted across the prairie, and the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of so many plows cutting into it. The decade also carried the last echoes of native resistance. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Geronimo stood as symbols of endurance, refusing to surrender quietly to a tide that seemed unstoppable. Their names carried dignity and sorrow alike. Whispered around campfires and feared in the offices of generals. Yet by the close of the 1880s, even their voices had been silenced. Sitting Bull killed, Geronimo forced into surrender. With them ended an era of open defiance, leaving behind only memory and mourning. Picture an abandoned camp at twilight, teepees standing empty, the smoke of a dying fire curling upward into the fading light. A child's toy, carved from wood, lies forgotten in the grass. The wind stirs through tall prairie weeds, carrying away the last traces of laughter and footsteps. What had once been a homeland alive with song was becoming a frontier carved into lots and deeds. The government spoke of progress and civilization, but for Native families, it meant confinement to reservations, loss of hunting grounds, and the slow erosion of traditions. Elders tried to pass on their stories and prayers, teaching them in whispers to children who would soon be sent to boarding schools designed to strip away language and identity. It was a quieter form of violence, one that sought to erase not only land, but spirit. And yet, even in those years of loss, resilience endured. Ceremonies were held in secret. Songs were sung in low voices. The heartbeat of drums continued to echo, though faint, against the sweep of change. The prairie still remembered, and so did the people who carried its memory forward. When we look back on the 1880s, it is easy to see the skyscrapers, the inventions, the glowing lights of progress. But out on the open land, under the wide and star-filled sky, another truth lingered, a truth of displacement and grief, of promises broken, and of nations whose roots ran deep into the soil of America. The native lands of the 1880s were fading, but they were never truly gone. They remained in the wind, in the rivers, and in the stories that refused to die. And if you listen closely in the quiet of night, you can almost hear them still. The whisper of grass in the prairie winds, carrying memories of a world forever changed. By the early 1880s, the American frontier was still alive with stories of daring outlaws, dusty saloons, and lawmen standing tall. Yet even as legends grew, the end of that era was already in sight. The West was changing, and with it came moments that felt like both climax and conclusion, marked not so much by the roar of guns, but by the silence that followed. One such silence fell in the town of Tombstone, Arizona, in 1881. On an autumn afternoon, a dispute that had been simmering for months reached its breaking point near a corral at the edge of town. The names became famous: Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, the Clantons, the McClorys. Words were shouted, guns were drawn, and within half a minute, the dust had settled. 3 men lay dead, and the rest stood shaken, their pistols still warm. But history often remembers the noise louder than the quiet. What lingered afterward in Tombstone was not the crack of revolvers, but the stillness of the street once the smoke had drifted away. A horse pawed nervously at the ground. A shopkeeper closed his shutters. Families pulled their children indoors. For all the tales that would later be told of bravery and vengeance, those who lived through it mostly remembered the hush. The uneasy recognition that the Wild West had crossed another threshold toward its own ending. A year later, in Missouri, another gunshot echoed, this one marking the fall of Jesse James. Once romanticized as a Robin Hood figure, James was betrayed by one of his own men and shot in the back as he adjusted a picture on his wall. There was no grand duel, no dusty street standoff. only a quiet house, a startled family, and the sudden end of a man whose name had carried both fear and fascination across the frontier. These moments, brief as they were, seemed to carry more weight than the bullets themselves. They symbolized the closing of an age. The Wild West of dime novels and campfire tales was giving way to railroads, telegraphs, and the steady march of law and order. The wide-open spaces that once sheltered fugitives were now mapped and parceled, claimed by settlers and surveyed by government hands. Picture a saloon in the dim light of evening. The piano player rests his hands, the last chord hanging in the smoky air. Outside, the desert wind sweeps through the street, carrying with it the faint echo of hoofbeats. Men who once boasted of shootouts now sit quietly, their eyes turned toward the growing towns and the new ways of life pressing in. The romance of the outlaw lingers, but the reality is one of endings. For the people who lived through those years, the gunfights were less about glory than about the unease of change. Communities longed for safety, for schools and churches, for mornings when children could walk the streets without fear. The deaths of men like Jesse James, or the infamous day at the OK Corral, were reminders that the time of lawlessness was drawing to a close. By the mid-1880s, the West was no longer the untamed frontier of myth. It was becoming something different, still vast and beautiful, but bound now by rails and wires, by towns and laws. And while stories of gunshots would live on in song and legend, what truly defined the moment was the silence that followed. A silence that spoke of endings and of the slow passing of an age that would never come again. On a spring evening in Chicago, 1886, the streets hummed with more than the usual sounds of clattering carriages and factory whistles. There was a new murmur rising, carried in chants and footsteps, the voices of working men and women demanding something simple yet revolutionary: an 8-hour workday. For years, laborers had bent their backs in mills and factories for 12, sometimes 14 hours at a stretch. The day began before dawn, ended after dark, and left little room for family, for rest, or for dignity. Children, too, labored beside their parents, their small hands tending machines in rooms thick with dust. The promise of progress in the Gilded Age had come at a steep price, and by the mid-1880s, workers across the nation were ready to ask, how much is enough? In Chicago, the tension found its breaking point. On May 1st, thousands filled the streets in peaceful demonstration, banners lifted high. For a brief moment, the energy was hopeful, almost festive. Workers marching shoulder to shoulder, voices rising in unison, calling for fairness. But just days later, in Haymarket Square, a protest descended into tragedy. As police pressed into the crowd, a bomb was thrown. In the chaos that followed, shots rang out. When silence finally settled, both officers and workers lay dead or dying. The event shook the nation. Newspapers painted the protesters as radicals, even anarchists, while others saw martyrs who had paid with their lives for the dream of a fairer day. The truth, as always, lived in the quiet in between. Families mourned, streets fell still, and the cause of labor carried forward, marked by grief, but not extinguished. From those ashes came something new. Later that same year, the American Federation of Labor was founded, an organization meant not just to protest, but to negotiate, to give the working class a unified voice. Its message was steady and practical. Fair wages, safer conditions, reasonable hours. It was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a long march toward dignity that would stretch well into the next century. Picture a worker returning home after one of those marches. His boots are worn, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but his eyes carry a quiet pride. He sits at a wooden table where a lamp flickers. His wife sets down a bowl of stew, children peering curiously at him, as if he has carried the spirit of something larger than himself into their small apartment. He does not speak of politics or speeches. He simply eats in silence, and in that silence, there is resolve. The Haymarket Affair, as history would call it, was both a wound and a spark. It revealed how fragile peace could be in a time of unrest, but also how determined the working class had become to carve out a fairer existence. Every step taken on cobblestone streets, every banner lifted into the smoky sky, was a declaration that progress could not belong only to the wealthy. It must belong to the men and women who turned the wheels, stoked the furnaces, and built the nation with their hands. The voices of the 1880s were not always heard in the halls of power, but they echoed through the streets and into history. They were the sound of footsteps crossing bridges after long shifts, the rhythm of hammers striking steel, the low murmur of a family sharing bread at the end of a weary day. In those voices lived both sorrow and hope, the conviction that America, even in its gilded glow, could still find its conscience. Across the vast open fields of America, far from the noise of factories and the clamor of crowded cities, another struggle unfolded in the 1880s, a quieter one, but no less profound. It was the burden carried by the farmer, whose livelihood depended on the earth itself. In those years, the American countryside still seemed endless. Wheat fields swayed in the wind like golden oceans, and rows of corn stretched so far they met the horizon. On summer evenings, the air was filled with the hum of insects and the faint lowing of cattle, sounds that had echoed across the plains for generations. But behind the pastoral beauty lay a rising tide of anxiety. Prices for crops were falling, railroads charged high rates to ship produce to market, and debt pressed heavily on families already living close to the edge. Imagine a farmer standing alone at dusk, leaning against his wooden fence. His hands are rough and cracked from work, his shoulders bent with fatigue. He gazes across acres of land that once promised prosperity, now yielding less than the labor demanded. The barn roof leaks, the plow sits rusting by the shed, and the bank's notice tucked inside his pocket weighs heavier than the soil clinging to his boots. The cycle of debt was relentless. Many farmers had borrowed to purchase seed, tools, or new machinery, believing that higher yields would secure their future. But with global markets shifting and surpluses driving prices down, each harvest often brought more disappointment than relief. Wheat or cotton that once brought hope now seemed to mock the effort it required. Each wagon load fetched too little at market, and each season's end brought another unpaid bill. Isolation added to the burden. Neighbors were often miles apart, and while church gatherings or barn raisings offered moments of fellowship, the daily grind was one of long hours and solitude. A farmer's wife worked just as hard, tending a garden, sewing clothes, preserving food, raising children, and often taking on field labor as well. Their lives were woven together with resilience, yet both carried the weight of constant worry. What if the weather turned? What if the crops failed? Out of this strain, voices began to rise. The Grange movement, formed earlier, continued to gather strength, offering farmers a place to meet, to share knowledge, and to push back against the powerful railroads and middlemen who seemed to profit from their labor. By the late 1880s, farmers' alliances spread across the countryside, uniting isolated men and women into a broader cause. They spoke of cooperative buying and selling, of standing together so that the lone farmer's cry might be heard as part of a chorus. Picture a lantern-lit meeting in a wooden hall, its windows glowing softly against the dark prairie night. Inside, farmers sit on rough benches, their hats in their hands, listening to a neighbor speak about fairness and hope. The air smells faintly of hay and kerosene. Outside, the horses tied along the fence shift and snort, their breath clouding in the cool evening air. These gatherings were more than meetings. They were lifelines, reminders that even in hardship, they were not entirely alone. Yet, despite these sparks of solidarity, the burden remained heavy. Farmers often went to bed with full knowledge that tomorrow's labor might not ease their worries. And still, they rose before dawn, laced their boots, and walked back into the fields. For the land was not just work, it was identity, inheritance, and faith. To abandon it felt impossible, even when it seemed to give back so little. The story of the 1880s farmer is not one of triumph, but of endurance. Their voices may not have filled the headlines like the strikes in Chicago or the building of skyscrapers, but their struggle was no less vital. It was the quiet resistance of those who turned soil into sustenance, who bore the weight of debt and disappointment with stoic courage, and who dreamed that someday the scales of fairness might tip in their favor. And when the evening wind swept across the fields, carrying the scent of earth and grain, it whispered both their sorrow and their strength, reminding us that America's story was not only written in its cities, but also in the silent furrows of its farmlands. High in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, the year 1889 carried a quiet unease. Spring rains had come heavy, feeding rivers that were already swollen, while far above the valley of Johnstown stood a dam, an old earthen wall holding back a man-made lake. For weeks, whispers of worry drifted through the town below. People spoke of cracks and leaks, of water levels rising dangerously. Yet life, as it so often does, went on. Children walked to school, shopkeepers swept their porches, and factory whistles marked the hours. On May 31st, the dam gave way. What followed was not simply water rushing downhill, it was an avalanche of earth and timber, homes and bridges torn apart and hurled forward with unimaginable force. The wave roared down the valley at nearly 40 miles an hour, carrying whole freight cars, massive trees, and fragments of lives lived quietly until that moment. Houses were swept from their foundations, barns shattered like matchsticks, and families found themselves caught in a tide that gave no warning and no mercy. Survivors would later recall a sound unlike anything they had ever heard. It was not just the crash of water, but a deep, consuming roar, as though the earth itself were collapsing. In a matter of minutes, over 2,000 souls were lost. Johnstown became a place of silence, broken only by the cries of the living, searching among the ruins for those they loved. The scenes that followed were almost too heavy to grasp. Streets were buried in tangled wreckage, logs, twisted iron, shattered beams. A mother stood barefoot in the mud, clutching a child who would not wake. Men dug frantically with their hands, pulling neighbors from the debris. Fires broke out where oil tanks had burst, their flames dancing across water still choked with rubble. And yet, even in this darkness, a light appeared, not from invention or progress, but from human compassion. Clara Barton, already known for her tireless care during the Civil War, led the American Red Cross into action. With her came supplies, blankets, food, and comfort. She moved through the broken town quietly but firmly, bringing a sense of order to despair. In church basements and makeshift shelters, survivors found not only relief, but the reassurance that they had not been forgotten. Picture, for a moment, a group of children huddled by a lantern late that night, their faces smudged with soot and tears. They listen as an older woman hums a lullaby, soft, trembling, but steady. Outside, the rain still falls. Inside, despite the sorrow, a fragile thread of hope begins to weave itself among the ruins. The Johnstown flood was not only a disaster of water and stone, it was a reminder of vulnerability, of how fragile even the strongest seeming structures could be when pride and neglect outweigh caution. It revealed both the cruelty of fate and the strength of those who endure. For those who lived, the memory lingered long after the valley was rebuilt. Survivors spoke of how the river seemed to whisper differently in the years that followed, its voice carrying echoes of that terrible day. Each time the clouds gathered, hearts quickened with unspoken fear. And yet, slowly, life returned. Shops reopened. Schools filled again with laughter. Gardens bloomed where debris once lay. Still, the sorrow of Johnstown in 1889 remains etched in America's memory, a story not only of destruction, but of compassion that rose in its wake. The floodwaters receded, but the lessons endured, of community, of resilience, and of how in our darkest hours, kindness often shines the brightest. And so, in the quiet of this reflection, as the rain softens against the roof of memory, we pause to honor them. The lives lost, the hands that helped, and the courage that carried a town through its deepest night. While sorrow weighed heavily on towns like Johnstown, elsewhere in America, the decade revealed a different face, a face glowing with invention, with ideas that promised to reshape everyday life. In the 1880s, the spark of human ingenuity burned brightly, and from it came a sense that the future itself was being pulled a little closer to the present. Imagine the year 1882 on a September evening in Lower Manhattan. Pearl Street, not yet famous, hummed with anticipation. Crowds gathered outside, drawn by whispers of a miracle. Thomas Edison's electric station was about to bring light to the night. Inside modest brick buildings, dynamos spun, humming with a strange rhythm that seemed almost alive. Then, with the pull of a lever, electricity flowed into wires strung along the street, and suddenly, lamps burst into radiance, windows lit up, sidewalks glowed, and the darkness that had cloaked the city for centuries receded in an instant. For the first time, night was not the end of activity, but the beginning of something new. Children pressed their faces to the glass, marveling at a glow that seemed to come not from flame, but from air itself. Workers on their way home paused, doffing their caps in disbelief. And somewhere, perhaps in a small tenement apartment, a mother whispered to her child, "The world will never be the same." Inventions did not stop with light. Across the ocean in Germany, Carl Benz tinkered with gears and pistons, assembling what would be called the Motorwagen in 1885, the first true automobile. Though clumsy and strange to look at, it was a glimpse of mobility unchained from the horse. Imagine the rattle of that three-wheeled carriage as it rolled down a cobblestone lane, its engine sputtering like a heartbeat out of sync, but alive nonetheless. Few could guess that this awkward contraption would open the road to entire highways, cities connected by more than rails, and families who would one day pile into cars for Sunday drives and cross-country adventures. The spirit of invention was everywhere. Telephones spread into more homes, bringing distant voices across copper wires. Typewriters appeared on office desks, their sharp clatter promising speed and efficiency. In kitchens, new stoves made meals quicker, while sewing machines lightened burdens in parlors and workshops alike. These were not grand monuments like skyscrapers or bridges. They were small revolutions, each one altering the rhythm of daily existence, and yet, with every invention came a mixture of awe and unease. Electric light was dazzling, but some feared it would rob the night of its mystery. Automobiles fascinated, but neighbors wondered if they were dangerous, too noisy, too unnatural. Even typewriters were met with suspicion. Would the art of handwriting disappear, replaced by the cold imprint of keys? Such is the way of progress. Wonder hand in hand with worry. Still, it is hard not to feel the tenderness of that moment when invention first touched ordinary life. Picture a rainy evening in New York, the streets glistening beneath the new electric lamps. Carriages splash through puddles, their wheels echoing against brick walls, while shopkeepers linger later than ever before, their displays glowing under steady light. A sense of possibility hangs in the damp air. If this is possible, what else might tomorrow hold? The 1880s were often called gilded, but they were also illuminated, not only by the light of Edison's bulbs or the sputter of Benz's engine, but by the imagination of countless minds who dared to ask, what if? Their inventions stitched threads of the future into the fabric of the present, ensuring that even as hardship and sorrow shadowed much of the decade, hope always had a way of flickering back to life. And so, as the rain tapped against windows and the city glowed brighter than it ever had before, America stepped quietly, almost unknowingly, into the modern age. One spark, one idea, one invention at a time. Along the East River in 1883, the people of New York witnessed something extraordinary. Rising above the masts of ships and the rooftops of tenements, a pair of stone towers stretched skyward, linked by cables that shimmered like harp strings in the morning light. It was the Brooklyn Bridge, and when it opened that spring, it did more than connect Manhattan to Brooklyn. It seemed to tether the future itself. For years, the bridge had been a dream on paper, its construction marked by tragedy, illness, and skepticism. John Roebling, the visionary behind it, never lived to see his creation completed. His son Washington, crippled by illness during the project, directed much of the work from his sick room, his wife Emily carrying instructions to the engineers on site. The story of the bridge was not just about stone and steel. It was about endurance, about human will refusing to bow before hardship. When the first crowds crossed it, many walked cautiously, their footsteps tentative upon the great span. Horses pulled wagons across, hooves echoing against wooden planks. Mothers clutched children's hands tightly, unsure if the bridge would hold. But as more ventured out, awe began to wash over them. From the center of the span, the view unfolded like a promise. The harbor glinting with sunlight, the Statue of Liberty not yet weathered by time, ferries gliding below like toys upon the water. For ordinary people who had never traveled far, the bridge gave them a taste of wonder, an experience that said, "This is what humanity can achieve together." The Brooklyn Bridge was not only an engineering triumph, but also a symbol of faith and progress. At night, as gas lamps twinkled along its cables, young couples strolled hand in hand, their hearts stirred by the beauty of something so immense and yet so graceful. Children pointed upward, marveling at how stone could reach so high, how cables could hold so firm. Even now, more than a century later, the bridge still whispers of that first moment when the impossible became real. Across the ocean, another structure was rising, a tower unlike any the world had seen. In Paris, 1889, crowds gathered at the Exposition Universelle to witness the unveiling of Gustave Eiffel's Iron Giant. At over 1,000 feet tall, the Eiffel Tower dwarfed every building on Earth, a lattice of metal reaching into the clouds. Some called it ugly, a monstrous intrusion upon the city's skyline. Yet others felt only wonder. To stand beneath it was to feel both small and infinite, caught in the spell of a new age of ambition. Though the Eiffel Tower was French, Americans felt its resonance too. Newspapers reported on its height, its daring design, its ability to pierce the sky itself. In a decade where bridges spanned rivers and skyscrapers began to pierce city skylines, the tower seemed a cousin to their own ambitions, proof that the world was stepping into modernity together. Picture the scene. Twilight in Paris, the tower's silhouette framed against a lavender sky, while in New York, the Brooklyn Bridge glimmers across dark waters. On two continents, people looked upward and felt the same stirring in their chests, that blend of pride, awe, and curiosity that only great works of human hands can inspire. What bridges and towers offered was more than stone and steel. They offered reassurance that the future could be reached, that humanity's reach could extend just a little higher, a little farther. They promised connection, not just across rivers, but across nations and imaginations. And so, in the quiet rhythm of the 1880s, while factories clattered and farms struggled, there were these moments of grandeur, places where the world seemed to pause and admire what was possible. Bridges and towers, standing tall against the horizon, reminded a generation that progress was not always cold or cruel. Sometimes it was breathtaking. Beyond the clamor of factories and the daring of bridges, the 1880s carried another kind of transformation, one that unfolded quietly in the pages of books, in the laughter of theaters, and in the drifting notes of music played late into the night. It was not just a decade of steel and invention, but also of stories and melodies, of culture taking root in ways that would outlast even the tallest towers. On bookshelves, a single name seemed to echo across parlors and classrooms alike: Mark Twain. In 1884, his Adventures of Huckleberry Finn slipped into the world, a tale that wandered along the Mississippi River with the slow, rolling rhythm of the water itself. Readers laughed at Huck's wit, pondered the moral dilemmas of his journey, and for many felt a stirring recognition. This was America's voice, raw and unvarnished, yet tender. In small towns and big cities alike, families sat by lamplight, one person reading aloud while the others listened, the words stitching themselves into memory. The theater, too, was alive. Vaudeville houses flickered with gaslight, offering an evening escape for pennies. Audiences sat shoulder to shoulder, their laughter mingling with the smoke of cheap cigars as comedians, dancers, magicians, and singers filled the stage. It was a patchwork of entertainment, sometimes silly, sometimes profound, but always a reminder that even in an age of hardship, people craved joy, surprise, and the comfort of shared laughter. And then there was the music. Something new was beginning to stir in the taverns and parlor rooms. Ragtime. Its syncopated rhythms slipped into the air like a playful secret, a sound unlike the strict marches or solemn hymns that had dominated before. In small bars, a pianist would tap out a jaunty tune, and before long, feet tapped beneath tables, conversations paused, and eyes sparkled with the delight of hearing something fresh, something alive. Those early notes of ragtime would ripple outward, carrying with them the seeds of jazz, a music that would one day define much of the American spirit. Picture a scene in 1887, a dimly lit saloon somewhere along the Mississippi. Outside, the river rolls on, black and silent under a thin moon. Inside, the air is warm with bodies and the clink of glasses. A piano stands against the wall, its keys worn smooth. The player leans forward, fingers moving with both precision and mischief, coaxing out a melody that dances over the hum of conversation. At a nearby table, a man closes his eyes, letting the rhythm carry him back to boyhood. Across the room, a woman hums softly, her foot tapping in time. In that moment, the hardships of the day fade, replaced by the simple wonder of sound. The 1880s were also a time when museums and libraries grew, evidence of a hunger not only for work and progress, but for knowledge and beauty. Cities opened their first great public libraries, their shelves lined with volumes that invited the curious to step into worlds beyond their own. Art exhibitions brought European paintings across the Atlantic, their colors and brushstrokes sparking debates in parlors and lecture halls. Even those who could not afford fine art found themselves swept into conversations about culture, as if America itself were declaring, "We, too, have stories to tell, songs to sing, beauty to share." What made this bloom of culture so remarkable was its intimacy. It was not always grand or polished. It was a family gathered in a kitchen, someone picking up a fiddle after supper. It was a book read aloud until the lamp oil ran low. It was a new song drifting from a doorway on a summer night. These small, quiet acts carried as much weight as the great inventions, because they nourished the heart while the rest of the age strained to build. In remembering the 1880s, one cannot forget the steel, the bridges, the machines. But just as vital was the laughter of vaudeville, the turning of Twain's pages, the first notes of ragtime that hinted at a century of music yet to come. Culture bloomed in ordinary places, reminding people that progress was not only about what was built with hands, but what was created in spirit. And so, while towers rose and factories thundered, a softer revolution took hold, one carried in words, in melodies, and in the unshakable human need for beauty. While the engines of progress roared and the pulse of industry beat steadily, everyday Americans sought lighter rhythms to balance the weight of work and worry. In the 1880s, leisure began to take on forms that still echo through time. Simple games, organized sport, and quiet moments of play that gave relief to both body and spirit. Baseball, already the nation's favorite pastime, was changing. In 1884, pitchers were finally permitted to throw overhand, altering the very nature of the game. No longer limited to the underhand tosses of its early days, the pitcher's arm could now whip forward in a blur, the ball racing toward the batter with new speed and spin. Crowds gasped at the first strikeouts, and batters adjusted their stances with fresh determination. Picture a summer afternoon in St. Louis. Children perched along a wooden fence, caps askew, eyes wide as the crack of bat against ball rings across the dusty diamond. The air smells of cut grass and horse-drawn carriages, while the cheers of 100 voices mingle with the sounds of the city. Baseball was no longer just a game. It was becoming a tradition. Another sport was slowly finding its footing on American soil: football. Guided by the vision of Walter Camp, the father of American football, the chaotic scrums of rugby began to take on new shape. The line of scrimmage, the snap from center, and the idea of downs all emerged in the 1880s. At Yale and Princeton, young men in woolen uniforms collided on muddy fields, their shouts carried on the autumn wind. It was rough, sometimes brutal, but it spoke to a growing appetite for competition, for order within chaos. Around the fire afterward, players nursed bruises, but spoke with pride. They were shaping not just a sport, but a ritual that would one day dominate Saturday afternoons across the nation. Golf, too, made its first quiet appearance in America during this decade. In Foxburg, Pennsylvania, 1887, a small course opened its greens to curious players. Imported from Scotland, the game seemed almost foreign at first. The stillness, the precision, the careful swing against the hush of the countryside. Yet it offered something different, a slower, more reflective pastime. Imagine the click of a club against ball, the arc of flight against a wide sky, and the gentle roll across the grass. For those who played, it was less about victory and more about the peace found in the open air. Beyond organized sports, everyday play carried its own charm. Children raced down dirt lanes on safety bicycles, their new design lowering wheels and making the ride less perilous than the towering penny farthings of the past. With the wind tugging at their hair and laughter spilling into the street, these rides were little tastes of freedom. To a child in the 1880s, a bicycle was more than a toy. It was a chance to see beyond the block, to feel the thrill of movement and possibility. Not all pastimes needed equipment or fields. Summer evenings were filled with simple pleasures, rolling hoops down sidewalks, tossing marbles in dusty yards, or skipping stones across the still surface of a pond. Families gathered for picnics, spreading blankets on meadows where fireflies flickered after dusk. Neighbors played cards by lamplight, the shuffle of the deck mingling with the low hum of conversation. Even in an age of upheaval, there were these softer rhythms, these rituals of joy that reminded people of the sweetness in ordinary life. Sports and pastimes of the 1880s were more than diversions. They were glimpses of community, of belonging, of the human need to step away from labor and find rest in play. They planted the seeds of traditions that would endure for generations. Baseball diamonds in every town, football fields buzzing with autumn energy, golf courses spreading across rolling hills, and bicycles becoming symbols of independence. And in those small, timeless moments, whether it was the cheer of a crowd, the laughter of children, or the quiet of a summer picnic, the 1880s revealed that even in a gilded, restless age, there was room for simple joys, for play that touched the heart as deeply as progress stirred the mind. Amid the noise of industry and the thunder of trains, daily life in the 1880s unfolded with a quieter rhythm. Beyond the headlines of invention and politics, there were the small rituals, the familiar objects, and the gentle routines that gave shape to ordinary days. These details may seem modest now, yet they carried the weight of comfort and memory for those who lived through them. Consider a small town schoolhouse, built of wood and warmed by a single stove in the center of the room. Inside, children of all ages sat together, their desks lined in uneven rows, slates balanced carefully on their laps. A stern but devoted teacher guided lessons in reading, arithmetic, and geography, her voice steady as chalk scraped against the board. The air carried the faint scent of coal smoke and ink, and outside the windows, fields stretched wide, waiting for the return of the children at day's end. For many, this single-room schoolhouse was not only a place of learning, but a reminder that progress, though slow, was being handed from one generation to the next. At home, the pantry shelves revealed another rhythm of life. Bottles and tins promised cures for ailments that few truly understood. Patent medicines, colorful elixirs with bold labels, lined shop counters and kitchen cupboards alike. Some were laced with opium, others with alcohol, yet they were trusted remedies in a world where doctors were scarce and hope was often bottled in glass. A mother might pour a spoonful of syrup for a coughing child, whispering reassurances as the sweet, bitter liquid slid down. It was a fragile kind of faith, born from the human need to believe in healing, even when the science was still years away. On the shelves of apothecaries and general stores, another product appeared in 1886, Coca-Cola. First marketed as a medicinal tonic, it was served at the soda fountain in tall glasses, its fizz rising like laughter through the air. Few could have guessed that this bubbling concoction, mixed in the back of an Atlanta pharmacy, would one day become a global icon. To those first customers, though, it was simply refreshing, an effervescent break from the heat of a southern afternoon. Evenings at home carried their own kind of comfort. Families gathered around kerosene lamps, their soft glow falling on patchwork quilts and wooden tables. A father might read aloud from the newspaper, the words carrying stories of distant cities, while children listened half sleepily, their eyes following the dance of shadows on the wall. Outside, the sound of crickets rose into the night, a steady chorus that wrapped the household in calm. Clothing hung from hooks by the door, woolen coats in winter, calico dresses in summer. Work boots, worn down by fields and factory floors, were set aside as bare feet padded across creaking floors. Laundry days meant tubs of water heated on stoves. clothes scrubbed against washboards until hands grew red. It was labor, yes, but it was also ritual, and with each fresh garment hung out to dry, there was a sense of dignity in the effort. Meals, too, were simple, yet grounding. Cornbread and beans, stews simmered for hours, pies filled with whatever fruit the season offered. In rural homes, butter was churned by hand, the rhythmic motion echoing through kitchens. In the cities, street vendors sold roasted chestnuts or hot sausages, their smoke drifting through alleys, mingling with the sharper scent of horse manure and coal dust. These were the flavors of an age, both humble and hearty, keeping families sustained through long days. Everyday life in the 1880s was not gilded with grandeur, but with familiarity. It was the clink of a spoon against a chipped cup, the warmth of a fire on cold nights, the steady turning of seasons that guided planting, harvesting, learning, and resting. In these small details, one can sense the heartbeat of an era, not in the towering inventions, but in the ordinary acts of living that held families together. For those who lived then, the Gilded Age was not only about skyscrapers and industry. It was about the simple courage of getting through each day, teaching children, trusting in cures, sharing meals, and finding comfort in the quiet rituals that gave life its meaning. And in those moments, beneath the glow of lamp or lantern, the 1880s revealed themselves not just as history, but as a tapestry of human endurance, woven from threads of ordinary grace. As the story of the 1880s draws to a close, the echoes of that decade linger like fading embers in the hearth. It was a time of contrasts, of glittering invention and quiet hardship, of towers rising and farmlands faltering, of hope carried across oceans and sorrow carried on floodwaters. The Gilded Age was not simply golden. It was lived in sweat, in courage, and in the ordinary acts of men and women who faced each day with steady hearts. When we look back now, through the lens of memory, we see the soft glow of lamplight falling across a schoolhouse desk. We hear the laughter of children racing bicycles down unpaved roads. We imagine the awe of a family standing beneath a flickering electric bulb, the first of its kind in their home. And we remember, too, the sorrows, the crowded tenements, the weary farmers, the floodwaters of Johnstown that swept away entire lives. Each story, whether joyful or sorrowful, wove itself into the fabric of the 1880s, leaving threads that still run through America today. The 1880s were more than the sum of their inventions or tragedies. They were an era where progress stretched forward like steel rails, while human hearts clung to the familiar rhythms of family, faith, and community. It was a decade gilded not only with wealth, but with the resilience of ordinary people. The mother who soothed a fever with a patent tonic, the teacher who guided children by lantern light, the immigrant who stepped off a crowded ship and whispered a prayer of hope. They were the true spirit of the age. Now, as we rest in the present, these memories become a kind of lullaby. They remind us that history is not distant, but alive in the echoes of our daily lives. Every bridge we cross, every ball game we cheer, every lamp we switch on carries a trace of those first moments when America in the 1880s was stretching, striving, and dreaming. So as you lie back and let your body sink into comfort, imagine yourself drifting through the twilight streets of that long-ago world. The lamps glow softly against brick walls. The sound of a fiddle drifts from a parlor window. A train whistle calls faintly across the night air, and above it all, the stars remain unchanged, steady guardians watching both then and now. Close your eyes and let the story fade into quiet. Let the gentle images of the 1880s, its hopes, its sorrows, its simple, enduring courage, settle around you like a quilt on a winter night. There is nothing more you need to do now. The past has spoken. The present asks only for your rest. And as always, from Sleepytown Radio, thank you for spending this time together, sharing in these quiet stories for quiet hearts. If tonight's journey brought you peace, I invite you to join us again. Leave a comment with your own memories or reflections. Subscribe so you'll never miss a story. And if you'd like, share this video so others may also find rest in its gentle rhythm. Your support helps keep these stories alive, carrying them into the stillness of many more nights. But for now, let the day slip away. The firelight softens, the night grows still, and your breath finds its own slow cadence. May your dreams be gentle, may your rest be deep, and may you wake tomorrow with a quiet strength all your own. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well.